look at here is we've been talking a lot about ideas of training and kind of stress responses. Talked a little bit about bioenergetics now and what goes on with that. So what I want to start doing is actually start talking about kind of these ideas of really getting into what the body starts doing when you put a stressor on this. And from some of the stuff we talked about in the first one there, talking about the idea of accommodation versus adaptation and what's going on there. Really, what we're trying to look at here is if you start putting exercise stressor on the body, it's really what happens in the short term. So when you first put the stressor on there, what is the alarm phase of kind of Salia's thing here? What is the body going to try to do to deal with this change? So when you start putting the stress of this endurance exercise on the body, in the very short or acute term, physiologically, what happens? And again, this is what your body does to respond to that exercise immediately. And that's what we're talking about to start with here. So what we'll do after we kind of walk through what are the things that the body does immediately, then we're going to start taking a look at these a little bit longer term in more of this chronic adaptation type of idea, or just in the longer term, physiologically, what does the body do to get more efficient at this? And bare minimum, we're usually looking at to start seeing those changes about 6 weeks of this. Obviously, some little changes will happen before that, but what would happen if you continue to do this? So physiologically, how did the body adapt? If any of you, and those of you that are doing class in person here, this might be the day that we're going to actually go outside and let's go for a little run and see what you feel like before, see what you feel like after. One of the things I think everybody's aware, though, if I said go out right now and go for a run, come back, and then start thinking about what you feel like, you probably come back and kind of go, okay, a lot of cardiorespiratory stuff happened. Oh man, I can really feel my heart beating. I'm breathing heavy. All these things that are happening there. We know from a little bit what we talked about with energy sources here that to efficiently start doing stuff, anything longer term, you need your heart beat to go up. You need your lungs to be breathing more, to supply that oxygen to generate that ATP that we're going to do during aerobic exercise. But in the short term, what does the body do to these exercise stressors? We're going to see, and really the first three you can kind of group together, we're going to see changes in what the body is doing here. So one of the big cardiovascular, and it's not just going to be circulatory, there's also going to see some respiratory changes and other things along with that. But first off, the one thing that probably people notice right away is if you went out and ran and then you stopped, you could almost feel your heart pounding in your chest. So you know that your heart rates went up. We're going to see that it's really the heart rate as well as the stroke volume. And those of you who have had A and P2 already, I know it's most of you, those two things together are what we talk about in terms of cardiac output. We're going to see there also is probably going to be changes in blood pressure, changes in flow, and like how much flow to certain areas, more or less to certain areas. And in the short term, we actually see a little bit less plasma volume. We'll see that these are things that can change over a longer period of time. The main thing, though, is probably one of the obvious things here is that your heart rate goes quite a bit up. One of the things that's interesting from rest to at exercise, most people's resting heart rate somewhere in that 60 to 80 beats a minute. It can sometimes double to triple during high-level exercise. So the heart rate is something that definitely can go up. One of the things that you normally notice if you're going to do anything that's endurance, if you exercise at a consistent thing, so if you go out and start running, your heart rate's going to be a little bit lower. It's going to climb, and then if you are continuing to stay the same pace, what you're going to see is it'll climb, and then it will tend to level off and find this spot where we have enough heart rate to actually supply the oxygen for the level that the muscles are working at, as long as you're doing some type of steady state and not pushing too far. We talk about this as steady state. It's this idea that the muscles and the energy supply systems here are getting enough oxygen to be aerobic, and that production and the delivery of oxygen is keeping pace with the demand of those muscles. Generally, we see very good most of the time, at least until you start reaching to those max areas, a pretty good direct correlation or proportion of how hard is the workload versus what is the heart rate. So you'll see this kind of consistent climb in the heart rate until you start maxing that output. And you can kind of see here is you're getting close to that VO2 max. You see how it starts toning down here. And what you're going to see is anything where it's like, let's say you were going a little bit past that and going into anaerobic, that heart rate is not going to continue to support that if you keep going there. You're going to see it will, if we took it a little bit further, it would actually level off as you're doing that one. But it's a nice, consistent kind of correlation with workload or what you're doing at what percent of VO2 max, so your workload versus what your heart rate is. And most people, that heart rate, the max is going to be, they usually say 220 minus your age. Again, depends on training age as well. The more exercise you've done, generally the lower your max heart rate is. As you age, your max heart rate gets a lot lower. The other thing is there is kind of that limit. So most people, it is going to be close to about that 200 through their college years is going to be about your max heart rate. We really don't see a lot of heart rates where there's not something going wrong with tachycardia, like badly not exercise induced but heart attack induced, where you start getting much above that. Every once in a while you'll see some people in events at younger ages can maybe get a little bit above that on a heart rate meter. But if you have a watch like I do and you're out running and your heart rate is saying your heart rate's 240, no, it's not. The other thing that we're going to see with the heart is a measure of this, and we talked about this a lot in AMP2, was this kind of idea of cardiac output when you start talking about the heart rate and the stroke volume. The stroke volume is just how much blood, and if we're talking about the systemic circuit and running, doing some type of exercise, it's going to be how much blood out of that left ventricle with each heartbeat. So stroke volume is just the volume of blood you pump out with each beat. Again, somewhat dependent on the size of your body. Could be genetics, also going to be somewhat dependent on training, but as you begin to exercise, what's going to happen in your heart is going to start pumping more. The other thing it's going to start doing is kind of going, all right, I'm going to try to squeeze a little bit more out of each beat here, so you generally will see, and it's again, if we went out and ran right now, or if you go out and run right now and come back, you'll feel your heart rate went up, but you also feel, like if you're just sitting there like relaxation like I am right now, you don't really feel your heart beating. If you go out and ran a mile as hard as you could and you came back, you're going to feel the heart beating in your chest. That is because that contractility went up. That strength of that contraction went up, which is going to actually increase the stroke volume. We're going to see more blood pumped out with each beat. And again, when it comes to VO2 max and stuff that we've talked about on this, the more blood you deliver to the muscles, the higher VO2 you can technically get to. This is part of the reason we'll see on some of these stuff here, as you start doing exercise for longer, you will start shunning blood away from certain areas, delivering it to those muscles. We'll also get into this with the heat. It's also part of the reason when in the hot temperatures you cannot perform at the same level. You can't send as much of your blood to those working muscles, and therefore you can't deliver as much oxygen. Again, the more empty though, the better the stroke volume. And again, this is going to increase somewhat. We're going to get increased ventricular activity here. Not as much of a pause in between stuff there, obviously, with those beats. But we're also going to be vasodilating those muscles, so we're getting less peripheral resistance. So we're able to push a little bit more out. There's a lot less afterload pressure. There's less of that there. The other thing is because you're moving your muscles and doing a lot of this, if you remember the veins having the valves, you're going to aid in that venous return to the heart, which is going to cause a little bit more stretching. So all these things, along with the increased contractility of the heart, are going to increase the stroke volume. This is not as linear. You're going to see it starts maxing out its efficiency a little bit sooner on, and you're like close to your max here. So the heart rate was a pretty consistent linear line, almost up to 100% of VO2 max. You can see at about 50% of VO2 max, you're getting close to that plateau where early on in response to activity, your stroke volume is going to go up, but there's just not as big of a dial that the body can twist on this one. So what really ends up happening is you start maxing this out a little bit sooner. If we look at this overall, it's going to see that it's kind of the combination of these two things is really talking about cardiac output, sometimes referred to as Q. But the fact that your heart rate is going up with exercise, your stroke volume is going up with exercise, we know our cardiac output is going to go up with exercise because that's stroke volume times heart rate, which is the amount of blood in a minute out of that particular ventricle. So your cardiac output is going to increase that blood supply, increase that oxygen delivery. We can see overall from at rest, let's say you're doing 60 beats at, 70 beats, 60 mils a beat. That gives you a particular output. You can see at maximal exercise, you can, in some cases, and under training, this might even be higher. But even someone that's sedentary to maximal exercise is probably going to get a 5-fold increase in cardiac output under max exercise workload. Can get much higher. Again, with training in that, we might be able to get up to 30, and at rest, you might be doing a little bit less with each beat. So you can get these 5 to 7-fold increases, somewhere around there, in cardiac output under exercise. And you see here it is kind of linear on this one. You're going to see, again, as you start maxing out your intensity, it is going to start getting a little bit flatter on that curve, but it's a pretty linear one here. Again, mainly because of that heart rate and what's going on with that, and that's linear. We're going to see still these pretty consistent increases up there. You can see it gets a little bit steeper down here when you have heart rate and stroke volume both getting together. You can see the curve gets a little bit steeper. And then it's pretty linear. And again, as we get closer to 100% of VO2, VO2 max, you're going to see it's going to start to plateau here. And you can kind of see different things, what they're going to kind of in beats per minute or heart rate. You can see lying down, you have to do a lot less. You're not even working against gravity in terms of how much you have to do to supply blood. But you can see when you start getting into these endurance activities where you're starting to actually run, that heart rate has to get much higher. You see it's also jogging and running that are really going to bring that stroke volume up. And you can see up to, in this case, a 4-fold increase running versus sitting or standing in terms of that cardiac output when you are actually being more active. So you can see it is definitely one of these things cardiovascular wise that the activity goes up a ton to try to support the stressor that's being put on the body. One thing that's interesting on this is in one of these over time, so in these steady state activities, there's going to be, and this starts getting out over a longer period of time. So I would say is I've done marathon running and stuff like that, and this is something you can definitely see over a half marathon to a marathon distance run, this idea of what is called cardiovascular drift. What it means is if you're trying to do a steady state activity, you might start out your run, let's say you're running an 8-minute mile, and it's doing 145 beats a minute. And it might be pretty consistent if it's, let's say it's flat ground, not a lot of elevation change, and you're just running steady state. It might be 145 beats a minute, 145 beats a minute. As you start doing this more and more, you start getting out to that hour plus, hour and a half. What you actually will start seeing is that 145 beats a minute after about 45 minutes might have went up to 150, and it might be at 155 or 160 towards the end of that run, that marathon. This is what is referred to as cardiovascular drift. What is happening here is you're going to get over a sustained steady state activity, you're going to get an increase in heart rate over the period of that activity. Why this is happening is the body is trying to deliver the same cardiac output. So we're trying to deliver that consistent cardiac output because the cardiac output is going to deliver the oxygen that supports the ATP development, which is going to support the working muscle. If stroke volume starts to go down, and so that contractility starts to decrease over the steady state. And what happens, that means you get a little gradual decrease in the stroke volume through this steady state activity. What happens to make up for that, because it is stroke volume times heart rate, you'll see this general climb in heart rate to maintain that consistent cardiac output, which is maintaining that steady state activity. We see this tend to happen a lot more, especially in very hot exercise type of environments. More so, you're going to see a bigger change in cardiac drift, but even just a long-term endurance exercise, you will tend to see this cardiac drift happening. And it's decreases in stroke volume leading to these increases in heart rate to maintain that cardiac output. And you can see it on this one here. You can see, looking at these kind of graphs here, I pointed out a couple of things that drop. So if you look at the little triangles here, did I point at the wrong ones? No, let's see here. We have stroke volume. You can see overall, let's start with stroke volume. Stroke volume dropped quite a bit. The other one was just this arterial pressure is a little bit lower. So you can see that those kind of drop. But what's kind of interesting, if you look on this graph here, over that period of time, that heart rate climbed a lot, but what has stayed almost consistent? So no increase or decrease much above that steady state. You have that cardiac output kind of going that center line there. And again, it's because drops in this led to increases in this, and because it's this times this, we get a consistent output of that heart over that steady state activity. Again, just something to keep in mind when you're looking at some of the stuff here, when some of these changes. Again, and as we start talking about adaptations, this is going to be some of the stuff that goes along with that. The other thing we see is we will see some changes in blood pressure. So blood pressure, again, force of that blood against the walls. We have the systolic blood pressure, which this should all be review, which is the max pressure that when the left ventricle contracts and pushes the blood out, it's that max pressure against those blood vessels. Diastolic blood pressure is that resting pressure when the left ventricle is relaxed. It's the minimal pressure that is always going to be on the vessel wall. What we're going to see is with endurance exercise, we tend to see increases in that systolic pressure relative to the intensity of the exercise. So we're going to see generally quite a bit is something that, especially if you're doing like a mile or a mile repeat, you're going to see that pressure spike, that systolic pressure. It's going to go up a decent amount. What's kind of interesting is diastolic blood pressure actually tends to reduce a little bit or change not hardly at all, regardless of intensity. And this has to do a little bit with the fact that when the ventricle is at relaxation, we've been vasodilating some of these blood vessels in order to get more blood delivery to the muscles, and you actually sometimes will see a small decrease in the diastolic, but a quite large increase in there. If you're doing weightlifting or exercising, a lot of times when you're completely clenching or forcefully contracting those muscles, and a lot of times if you're holding your breath and doing that Valsalva maneuver where you're like, that has a tendency to spike that, where you can get blood pressures, like it says there, 480 over 350 type of things, where you're spiking that pressure up. So resistance exercise, definitely different in terms of what it's doing to the blood pressure during that exercise. And again, this is kind of showing you this. It was kind of, if I remember right, this was different muscle groups. They were either doing an arm thing like this or doing a leg bike pedaling type of thing. But it was just kind of showing you that blood pressure changes under different levels of exercise intensity. You can see the systolic climbs, like I said, pretty linearly as we go here. Arms versus legs. I think they were measuring in the arms, so you see a little bit higher spike in the arms versus the legs on that one. But again, you can see systolic tended to increase, diastolic pretty low, went up maybe a little bit, but very little. And like I said, some cases you actually see it drop. So relative to that level of intensity, that oxygen consumption, systolic blood pressure increases, diastolic pretty consistent. So that at least shows you a little bit of this cardiovascular stuff here. What we'll do on the next one here is we'll look at some of those other variables that I talked about, the non-cardiac output-based stuff a little bit more, and talk about some of those other cardiovascular things. And then we'll start looking at the respiratory system and some of its short-term acute responses to this exercise stressor. I'll see you next time.